Today I'm giving you 40 ChatGPT techniques that you can or should be using every single day. Number one is to assign a role. ChatGPT and other chatbots tend to respond a lot better if you give them a role to inhabit. That way, it allows the AI to get more specific and often results in significantly better output. For instance, you could say you are an expert plotter with 20 years experience in crafting best-selling novels. While this isn't going to make everything perfect, it will up the quality of your prompt significantly when you use it consistently. Tip number two is to feed it your work. If you are interested in a particular style, it can be really hard to prompt the AI to get into that exact style that you are looking for. A way to shortcut this is to give it an example of your work. If you give it an example, it is much better at following that example. The first time I ever used ChatGPT, I had an article and I wanted to write several other articles that were exactly like it, but for a different topic. And so I wanted to follow the exact same format, the exact same structure. So I simply gave it what I had and said, write a section of an article like this, but do it for this topic instead. And it was able to follow my instructions quite readily. And this was back with GPT 3.5. before we even had access to more advanced models like GPT-4. My third tip is to brainstorm all of the topics that you want to talk about. Now on this channel, we talk a lot about fiction writing, but this is relevant in any situation where you are using ChatGPT, is to brainstorm. Brainstorming is possibly the most powerful use case for ChatGPT for the average person, because it allows you to think of things that you might not normally have thought of, or to get a more well-rounded brainstorm. I find myself using ChatGPT quite often when writing an article. Even if I'm not using AI to actually write the article, I will often go through, do my research, figure out what topics I'm going to cover in that article, and then I will give those topics to the AI and say, can you brainstorm any more? And it will often come up with one or two other ideas out of several that I think are actually worth using. Tip number 4 is to rename your chat logs. So in this case, the AI automatically assigns a name for your chat. But let's say you want to keep this a little more organized, because right now the system that ChatGPT has in place isn't great for organizing all of these chats. Well, one of the things you could do is you can actually change the things here and you can give it a system. So if I wanted to say this one is outlining, and then I'll give it a colon and say option 1. And then I can add all of the others and say outlining colon option 2, or, that's not the best example, but finding a way, some kind of system to keep them all organized so you are much better able to go through, scan through them, search through them, and find the ones that you are specifically looking for that you've saved. Tip number 5 is to ask follow-up questions. Now, this is one of the most important skills to learn, is how to process what it gives you. Ask it follow-up questions and then dig deeper, because usually what it gives you isn't necessarily that good to start with. And so you have to probe deeper and deeper, and you can get to something really good, but it takes a little back and forth with your human creativity in order to get there. Tip number 6 is to explain it to me like I'm 5. This is a useful tip that if you are trying to understand a concept, or maybe there's an article that you don't quite get, you can put it into ChatGPT and say, explain it to me like I'm 5. And then it will do that for you. In this case, we could put quantum theory to me like I'm 5, and it will tell me exactly. Imagine the world is made up of tiny, tiny Lego blocks. These blocks are so small that you can't see them, but they make up everything around you, your toys, your food, even you. And it goes on to explain quantum theory with that context. And it can actually result in some really insightful ways to learn about complex topics that you might not have been able to do because you weren't quite at the level to understand these really high level academic papers or whatever it is that you're dealing with. Tip number 7 is to use custom instructions. If you are working specifically with ChatGPT, you have the option to put in some custom instructions here about what we would like the AI to know about our project and how we would like the AI to respond to our project. If you can put in such things such as your style prompt into this space, it will remember that for the entirety of the chat, and you won't have to worry about it forgetting things as you go along. Tip number 8 is to share the thread link. If you go up here to the top right corner, you can see this area to share a link to the chat. So if you have a particular prompt that works well or a thread that you want to share with people, you can come up here and you can copy the link here, and it will have this entire chat copied so you can share it with other people. Tip number 9 is to be specific, and I cannot emphasize this enough. I know my other fellow AI YouTubers all agree on this as well. Shout out to Akello. But you need to be specific with your writing prompts. And if you don't, the output that it gives you will not be satisfactory. It's garbage in, garbage out. Tip number 10 is to turn ChatGPT into a tutor. And this can be on any subject. I'll show you an example here. You are an expert writing tutor and best-selling novelist. I want you to act as a tutor to me and any challenges I'm facing with my book. Be sure to always ask questions before responding. And that will make it, first of all, we're giving it a role here. And adding the information about becoming a writing tutor and asking it to ask you questions before responding is another important thing that will help it to ask you more probing questions that will help you to really think and dig deeper about different things that you might not have thought of if not prompted by the AI. So this is a really valuable tool to switch the tables so that it is now prompting you for information, which can be really valuable depending on what challenges you're working with. Tip number 11, and a lot of people are going to have a problem with this, but it is to go with ChatGPT Plus, because access to GPT-4 is significantly better. If you are going to be using ChatGPT at all, I would only really be using GPT-4 if at all possible. Now, if you are strapped for cash, which is totally understandable, and we've all been there at one point or another, I would not look at ChatGPT. I would look at other options such as Claude, because they have much better free options at this particular moment in time. Tip number 12 is to use plugins. So I have a couple of plugins here installed. I have video captions currently enabled, and I often enable this one, Web Pilot, to look at a specific link and extract information from that link. Chat with PDF is useful for working with PDFs. There are a number of plugins here that you can use to enhance your project, and depending on what it is. The ones I use most frequently are video captions and Web Pilot, because they have specific use cases that I use them for, such as transcribing a YouTube video, which really helps me in some cases when I'm doing research. And same with Web Pilot, adding in a link to a particular article in that particular case, it works really well. Speaking of Web Pilot, I highly recommend that you use ChatGPT to analyze the content of various web pages, because this is going to be a good way to learn and get a summary of information based on a simple prompt. I also like to give it an article and ask it to give me all of the key points of an article, because that is a good way for me to look at it, frame it, and then potentially use bits of the research from that article in something that I'm writing, just as I would if I were not using ChatGPT, but it allows me to really zone in on those specific points of information so that it saves me time in the research. Tip 14 is to save your prompts somewhere. Now, a lot of authors have different models for this. Some people use Notion, some people have Evernote, some people just put it in a Google Doc, and it's important to have some place where you keep all of these prompts, because there are going to be many that you find yourself using over and over and over again because it's so useful. I particularly have a number of style prompts that I use in various situations. Tip 15 is to story hack. Now, this one's for all my fiction authors out there. This is a term that I came up with, the act of analyzing a story into its component parts, because all stories have them, even the so-called literary novels. Every work of fiction, and nonfiction for that matter, can be broken down into component parts. Once you figure out what those frameworks are, you can reverse engineer them, and you can create something of your own built on those same frameworks, just as Star Wars or Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or a lot of, honestly, many different popular works are built on this framework of the hero's journey and other similar frameworks like it. ChatGPT can be used to analyze some of these frameworks. It can also be used to analyze scenes from popular media. Though, to be quite honest, a lot of this will need to be done yourself. Tip number 16 is to ask it to improve your flesh reading ease score. Sometimes you'll get content that is okay. It's maybe a little mangled in areas. It's not as clear and concise as it could be. And so there's this way of measuring that called the flesh reading ease score. And I have found myself that by putting the content into ChatGPT and asking it to improve that particular aspect, it will improve the readability of that text considerably. Tip number 17 is to use a chain of thought prompt. Now, a chain of thought prompt is where you basically walk the AI through a problem, and by doing so in multiple prompts, it's able to kind of figure out what it needs to do. So let's say, what do you know about the hero's journey 12-step template? I could just ask the AI to use this template in an outline, but I will often get much better results when I ask it what it wants to do first, and then it gives me information about this particular framework that I'm asking it about. And then once it's done this, I am able to say, hey, give me an outline of a story based on that framework that you just gave me, and it will often do a better job of writing the outline from that point on. Another example is if you're looking for criticism of your work, you can give it a chapter of your work and say, what are some things that you spot here that are issues? And it will give you a list. And then you could say, with those things in mind, go ahead and make some revisions. And it will usually do a better job of doing those revisions after you have asked it to identify what is wrong with the revisions, rather than just, hey, make some revisions and make this piece of work better. Tip number 18 is to ask the AI for prompts. Now, this one I don't particularly use too often because I think it's a little weird, but honestly, this is just another form of brainstorming, and many people use it quite effectively. And that is asking the AI, how would you prompt you to give me this result? And often, because the AI is actually very well aware of how its own structure is and how it works, it will give you an answer that is really useful. And then you can use that prompt to actually get a better result, or at least a different result from what you would have prompted it otherwise. Tip number 19 is for those fiction authors out there, and that is to interact with your characters. Business people, you can do this with your customer avatar as well. It's the act of putting together all of the information you have about your character or your avatar, put it into ChatGPT, and then ask it to function as that character. If you can do this, it will start to respond as this character. You can ask it questions, and the more information you provide it, the more realistic and fleshed out that character is going to become. And you can actually get some pretty interesting insights about your world, about your characters, about your customer avatar, and a lot more from that tip. Tip number 20 is to turn ChatGPT into a game. Now, ChatGPT is not all about work. It's not all about productivity or giving you results. Sometimes it can just be a game. All you have to do is go into the chat and say, you are a game master of a tabletop role-playing game, and I am your only character. Please give me an opening, walk me through the character creation process, then give me an opening scenario for the game. You can now respond to the AI, answer its questions, and then it will actually walk you through like a text-based RPG game, which can actually be quite a lot of fun. Tip number 21, and this is not really a tip for me because I am not a coder, but it is to use the AI for coding. AI is very good at doing basic coding problems. And so if you are struggling to figure out something wrong with your code in the software, whatever tool you're working on, you can use AI to not only troubleshoot it, but to actually write the code that you need. A lot of the basic grunt work that a coder spends honestly too much time on can be done using ChatGPT, so the coder can focus on some of the higher level things that you might want to think about. Again, I'm not a coder, but I know that ChatGPT does code very well, and if I did know more code, I would be in there all the time using it to create my new products. Tip number 22 is to use it for research, and you have to be careful with this one because, as with anything, you need to back up your sources. You need to make sure what you're getting is accurate. But ChatGPT is getting better and better at this and will only continue to do so to the point where hallucinations and aberrations aren't actually much of an issue in the future. Additionally, ChatGPT can give you insights on research that you might not otherwise be able to get from just trying to pour through different books on a subject. For instance, I write Arthurian fantasy, so I could say, what was life like for a merchant traveling in medieval, in 5th century Britain? And then it will be able to give me a somewhat intelligent answer. If the information is not necessarily there, it will be able to give me a solid hypothesis of what that might look like, which as a writer would be really useful. Tip number 23 is to use it to create a marketing plan. As a book writer, a marketing plan is incredibly important because it helps me identify my current customer, figure out where they are, and how I can go and get them and to view my book and to want to buy my book. It also allows me to put together a launch plan for every one of my books, which is incredibly useful for every launch. Tip number 24 is to outline a book, and this one is another really useful one for both fiction and nonfiction. ChatGPT is incredibly good at anything involving structure, and outlines are obviously very structural. You can use outlining templates that are common in fiction, such as the hero's journey, but you can also supply your own templates and ask it to use those as well. And if you're using it for nonfiction, you can use the same methods I talked about with brainstorming, where you can give it the list of chapters that you want and ask it to give you more chapters and any other ideas that you might want to include in that particular book of yours to help with your outline. Tip number 25 is to summarize. Summarization is one of the things that ChatGPT does best. You can ask it to summarize an article. You can ask it to summarize a lengthy conversation or a YouTube video, or any number of things. You can have it look at those things, in some cases transcribe them, give you the key points, the bullet points, and Bob's your uncle. Speaking of key points, tip number 26 is to extract the key points. I find this is an incredibly useful way to get the important bits of research from an article. I've talked about this a little bit already, but sometimes I will give it an article or a piece of text and I'll say extract the key points from this, and then I'm able to use those in my research by making it into those smaller bite-sized chunks. It makes it a lot easier for me. Tip number 27 is related. It's to write with key points. A lot of people think that ChatGPT cannot do original work because it was trained on a limited amount of data, and if the data in that data set does not include the data that you want it to write about, then it can't write about that thing. It can't write about current events, for example. But I have found that sometimes all I need to do is jot down a quick list of bullet points that I want to cover in my writing, and then give that to ChatGPT, and it can write all of those things very quickly and succinctly using the key points that I gave, and it still takes me far less time than it would for me to write out the whole thing in order to put together those key bullet points. Tip number 28 is to analyze the style. I've talked about this briefly as well, but giving it the style of your writing and asking it to analyze that style will give you a bullet point of a lot of the things that you are doing well, maybe a few things that you're not doing so well. And you can then take that style guide and give it to the AI, and it will write closer to that style. Which leads me to tip number 29, which is to write in that style. You can use the style guide that you have created, but you can also use existing styles that can often give you most of the way there. For example, you could do it in the style of a current famous public speaker, or you could do it in the style of a public domain author. I think there is an ethical line to be crossed that is at least blurry for authors who want to write in the style of an existing author, an existing living author whose work is in the current, who is not in the current public domain. Legally, that is something that you can do, but ethically, I would just maybe wait on that a little bit. But at the very least, you can still experiment, see what the kind of results are that you get, and continue on from there. Tip number 30 is to use advanced formatting. I particularly like to see everything that ChatGPT gives me in easy to scan formats. And so by this I mean shorter paragraphs, lots of bullet points and headings and subheadings, or you could format things in a table. When you ask ChatGPT to do it this way, it often does a better job at parsing the data and organizing it in a way that is really easy to understand for the human. Tip number 31 is to ask it recommendations for self-care. Now, I'm going to give this caveat for this one because having a therapist is always going to be the best option for helping you with your self-care. Not just a therapist, but maybe a nutritionist, seeing your doctor, talking to just your friends, your family. All of these are the best solutions. However, sometimes these people can't really give you personalized advice to the level that you might want. Or you might be in a situation where you don't have access to these kind of people. And in this case, I would recommend going to ChatGPT, explain it to your problem, and it will give you answers that are likely to help in some capacity. Even if the answers are a bit general, like get outside, go on a walk, do a little meditation, whatever the case is, you are likely not doing a lot of those things, and implementing some of the advice that it gives you, I can almost guarantee will improve your mental health. But as always, be sure to consult with a doctor or a therapist about things like that. Number 32 is to ask it for recipes. This is actually a fun one because it does produce semi-competent recipes. And if you are an author like me, it can be really fun to create recipes that you can then include in your books, that you could perhaps make a whole cookbook based on your books. Things like that could be a lot of fun. ChatGPT is a good way of getting most of the way there, but I do recommend you actually try out some of the recipes it gives you before you start recommending them to other people. Tip number 33 is to use it for your book description for you authors out there. And for those of you who are not authors, you can use AI in almost any aspect of your marketing copy. AI is actually really good at book descriptions and because it has been trained on a lot of them. A simple, hey, write a book description about this story that I've got can suffice, but there are also frameworks that you could look through and study and take those frameworks, put them into the AI and say, write a book description in this framework for this story, and it will give you an even better result. I'm currently working on a couple of prompts that follow frameworks in that matter, and so stay tuned. I hope to have something like that shortly. Speaking of marketing media, tip number 34 is to use AI for your headlines. Now, ChatGPT is maybe not the best at headlines. Claude is a little bit better, but ChatGPT can be really good if you give it frameworks. And it doesn't take very long to find frameworks for good headlines everywhere on the internet because they are very regularly used and they tend to work since like hundreds of years ago. So if you can find those frameworks, plug them into ChatGPT, you can have some really good templates for some amazing headlines for your emails, for your ad copy, for your YouTube videos, etc. Tip number 35 is to use AI and ChatGPT for your emails. A lot of people hate writing emails, and so if you can outsource some of that stuff to AI so that you don't have to spend as much time fiddling over every single word, then that can be a really good time saver as well. Tip number 36 is to use ChatGPT for writing articles. I particularly use this for a lot of my articles on my own personal websites, and I find it to be quite useful as a productivity assistant. Keep in mind that you should always be doing your own research, and just asking the AI for an article on a given subject is not going to produce quality content. You have to plan out the article, you have to outline it, you have to include all of the key points that you want to cover, and then use AI as a way of kind of fleshing those key points out, talking about them more in depth, and you'll have a much better article that way. Tip number 37 is to use AI for your social media. This is another area that a lot of authors, including myself, really hate to do. And so you can give it a topic and it can actually produce semi-competent social media posts for each of those things, and it can give you ideas for images to put together or videos to do or what have you. It can also do a pretty good job of taking what existing content you have, such as a YouTube video or an online article, and then chopping that into little bits that can be usable on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, whatever you have. Tip number 38 is to use ChatGPT for poetry. This can actually be a fun one, whether you're doing it for fun or doing it seriously. Poetry is one of those very brain-intensive practices, and using AI to give you a start can get you 50% of the way there. If you are a serious poet, it can get you there, and then you take it the extra mile. And if you're just doing it for fun, it can be really hilarious to construct haikus about the latest big news story or something crazy that happened to you last weekend, or even something totally ridiculous like a poem that you might use in a science fiction beach romance. Tip number 39 is to use my FITS model. Now, I made a whole video about this a little while back. FITS, F-I-T-S, stands for Framework, Identity, Task, Style. This is my framework for constructing a solid prompt, the kind that you will be using 80% of the time. You want to supply it the framework, you want to supply it an identity or a role, which I've talked about in an earlier tip. You want to give it the task, the thing it's supposed to do, and then the style, the way it's supposed to do it. Go see my old video for more information about that. Last but not least, we come to tip number 40, which is to use my fractal technique, which I also talked about in another video. Now, this isn't a technique that is original to me, but as far as I'm aware, I'm the first to name it and call it the fractal technique. It is basically the idea of starting with a small idea, expanding that idea into a story synopsis, expanding that story synopsis into a fully fleshed out outline, and then expanding each chapter of that outline into a series of story beats, and then expanding all of those story beats into finished prose. It is a way of working from something small to something bigger, and it is currently, I believe, the fastest method right now to construct decent, actually usable prose for a fiction book, and you can use a similar technique for nonfiction as well. Those have been my 40 techniques that you should be using daily or can be using daily with ChatGPT. You can also use many of these methods, not all of them, but many of them with Claude and with other AI tools out there. So I hope this was useful for you. I will see you in the next video.